Hello, welcome to History 1301 online with PowerPoints and narration. I'm learning how to do this. I'm actually kind of uncomfortable talking to my computer, but let's see if we can go and do this and kind of make it more like class. All right, we're going to start then with the period after the War of 1812. And one of the most interesting results of that War of 1812 was an increase in American nationalism. This increase in pride and patriotism and confidence that the United States has, primarily as a result of as they saw it, their victory in the War of 1812, especially that victory over the British in the Battle of New Orleans. We're going to start to see the United States, Americans tending to become more focused now on building their nation, on creating a strong economy, on creating an infrastructure, and no longer are they going to be so concerned about or so resentful toward Britain as they had been after the Revolution. They no longer felt that Britain did not respect them as a nation anymore. Again, the War of 1812, in a sense, at least in their own minds, had confirmed American independence. So Americans are seeing themselves more and more as Americans. They feel more united after this war is over. They're not just simply saying, I'm a New Yorker or I'm a Virginian. No, I'm an American, they might say. And more we start to see the country putting together a common vision for the future. And we're going to see that especially through some programs and policies that were beginning to be formed in Congress. Historians have called this the era of good feelings. These years right after the War of 1812, again, as Americans are regarding themselves more and more as Americans rather than Virginians or New Yorkers. Let's take a look and see what Congress is proposing. Okay, this is Representative Henry Clay from Kentucky. And after the War of 1812, Henry Clay proposed to Congress a plan called the American System that he believed would help in building the economy of the United States. The American system has essentially two parts. The first part of the system called for the implementation of a protective tariff on imports. Again, that's a high tariff on imported goods. That would make American-made products cheaper than their European competitors. He's hoping that with these higher tariffs on imports, Americans would not buy as many European imports. They would start buying American manufactured goods instead. American manufacturing could grow and prosper. In addition, though, any tariff income that would be coming into the Treasury as a result of the tariffs on imports could then be invested in the second part of the American system, which called for internal improvements, what we today would call infrastructure. For Americans at this point in time, infrastructure essentially meant roads. It meant gravel roads, well-defined gravel roads to replace the ruts in the road that had been made by the carriages that kept going over and over the same route over the years, and also the construction of a canal system. A man-made canal system that would link the port cities like New York and Boston through a land-based canal to the Great Lakes, where you could use the lakes then to transport them on to, say, Chicago, Illinois, and then out west to the territories. In addition, railroads were beginning to be built. The first rail lines in the United States were completed in 1827. And businesses saw the advantage of being able to move both people and products via railroads. So for many, the railroads would be another addition to that infrastructure link, along with roads, along with canals, that could start providing a network to be able to, again, to move people and goods more easily throughout the country. Now, Clay is not able to get the American system passed through Congress, but we do see that the states and private businesses will indeed fund some of the internal improvements. We are going to see, for example, canal building on a pretty large scale. We're going to see canal companies essentially taking the initiative to build canals, again, to link the port cities of the East Coast to the cities like Chicago and further west, through the Great Lakes, through the to the Ohio River, to the Mississippi, and beginning with the first canal completed in 1825, the Erie Canal. By 1848, the United States has about 4,000 miles of canals, built primarily in the northeastern part of the country. Railroads, as we said as well, could be considered internal improvements, and once again we see private business stepping up to the plate. Again, the first rail lines were completed in 1827. By 1848, American businesses had laid about 6,000 miles of rail line throughout the United States. That was more than twice the amount of rail lines in the rest of the world combined. So Congress may not be on board with funding these internal improvements. Congress was not on board with putting a protective tariff on imports at this point in time. But again, private businesses are stepping up. Private businesses are constructing canals, constructing railroads. However, we should note that although this era of good feelings we've been talking about did produce a sense of pride and patriotism, and bills like the American system being introduced to Congress to start working on building a stronger American economy and infrastructure, it still mattered what part of the country you lived in as to how you felt about things like this. Sectionalism was still a part of life. Americans may have been considering themselves more and more Americans rather than New Yorkers or Northerners or Southerners. But still, if you were a Northerner or a Southerner, you probably had a real difference of opinion on things like protective tariffs and internal improvements. So let's take a look at where the parts of the country stand on issues like this. On the issue of the protective tariff, what we find is that the northern states here, they supported the idea of protective tariffs. The northern states support protective tariffs. Most of the businesses and manufacturing that were being created at this time in history were in the north, and a protective tariff then would help American businesses to prosper. It would help American businesses to have a competitive advantage over their European competitors, because they'd be able to sell their products at a lower price. Foreign manufacturers are going to have to pass the cost of the tariff on to their consumers. So Northern American businesses like the idea of a protective tariff. It's good for Northern business. It's good for their region of the country. The South, on the other hand, is opposed to protective tariffs. Southern states, they're completely against protective tariffs. They don't have manufacturing and industry in the South. The South is primarily rural. They grow cotton at this point in time more and more than ever before. And the largest market for Southern cotton is in Europe, specifically Great Britain. So the South fears that if the United States puts high tariffs on European manufactured goods, that the Europeans might retaliate with high tariffs on American cotton. This would not be good for the Southern cotton business. So again, they oppose the protective tariffs. In addition, we should note, Southerners buy an awful lot more imported goods than did Northerners. Southerners didn't seem to like American-made products as much as they liked European-made products. So another concern for the South is if the United States puts high tariffs on European goods, that just means higher price for the imported products that they prefer to buy is going to hit them in the pocketbook. Now, on the issue of internal improvements, we also see differences of opinion. On the issue of internal improvements, Northerners and Westerners tended to support the idea of the government funding of internal improvements. Again, they see a lot of advantage if you can link the northern manufacturing centers to the west, again through a canal, through the Great Lakes, and then perhaps railroads out west. It's going to be good for both the north and the west. You're going to be able to get a lot more people out west. You're going to be able to get a lot more products out west, and you're going to be able to get raw materials like copper or silver or other minerals and resources. You're going to be able to get all that back from the west to the northern industries and manufacturers as well. So they support, the north and the west supports the idea of the government paying for the creation of the roads, the canals, and maybe even the railroads. The South, on the other hand, is against it. And the South says no. The South does not believe that the government should be spending their money on internal improvements. The South doesn't have any Great Lakes, for example, that need to be linked up to the northern ports. They don't see any need for fancy roads and infrastructure. Southerners don't want their tax dollars going to pay for these internal improvements that they just don't think is going to benefit them. So yeah, it matters as to what part of the country you live in, as to how you feel about these things, as to how you feel about the American system of protective tariffs and internal improvements. But there's another issue that is dividing Americans at this point in time, and that issue is slavery. The question is, will slavery be allowed to move into Western territories? As you begin to see people settling in the Missouri territory, in the Louisiana Purchase territory, many Southerners are moving west. They're taking their slaves with them, and they want to be able to have slavery in these Louisiana, in the states that are going to be carved out of the Louisiana Purchase. Now this is an issue because if you remember, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 had prohibited slavery in these first territories that were carved out of the Northwest territories. And many believed that that should be the example for all of the territories that the United States would create, that there should be no slavery allowed in any territories as the country grows. But again, you have a lot of Southerners moving into Louisiana territories, and so this does become a question. It becomes an issue, and we're going to see the United States now having to kind of decide, will they allow slavery to grow into the West? Now, this becomes an issue in 1820 when Missouri here, a territory in the Louisiana Purchase territory, applies for statehood. This is the first territory to apply for statehood from the Louisiana Purchase in which slavery had not already previously existed. So will there be slavery in Missouri or not? Now, this is an issue because when Missouri applies for statehood in 1819, there were 22 states in the Union. 11 of those states were free states. 11 of those states were slave states. You got a 50-50 split between the number of states that allow slavery and the number that don't. And this is important in the Senate, because remember, in the Senate, each state has 2 senators, equal representation. So you've got an equal number of senators from slave states and an equal number from free states, which means essentially that you can't get through any bill for or against slavery through the United States Senate. This is going to be important in whether or not slave states gain more power in the country. Now, anti-slavery forces in the North are absolutely adamant that slavery should not be allowed in Missouri. That the example from the Northwest Ordinance should be applied to Missouri. But as I said, Southerners are just as determined that Missouri should allow slavery, that slavery should be allowed to grow into the West. Now, debate on this bill is going to be underway then for the next year or so in Congress. But in 1820, there'll be a compromise. In 1820, a compromise bill was passed in Congress known as the Missouri Compromise. And with the Missouri Compromise, the United States in many ways just kind of postpones having to deal with the issue of slavery for a while. They're going to postpone having to make these hard decisions about slavery for another generation. So here are the three provisions of the Missouri Compromise. And yeah, these are kind of important. 1. Missouri will be admitted to the Union as a slave state. But 2, at the same time, Maine, up here in the corner, Maine is going to be admitted to the Union as a free state. Now that means that the balance of power between slave states and free states will be preserved. Okay. 3rd, it was agreed that the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory would be divided along the border of the southern border of Missouri, extending all the way to the end of the Louisiana Purchase. Okay? Everything north of this line, except Missouri itself, would be free territory. Free territory, free states. Everything south of the line, plus Missouri, will be slave. The Louisiana Purchase is divided along the southern border of Missouri. All territory north of that line, except Missouri, will be free territory. All territory south of it, plus Missouri, will allow slavery. And so with any compromise, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, both sides get something they want. Congress will prohibit slavery through much of that Louisiana Purchase territory, in a sense proving or asserting their right to determine where slavery will or will not exist. And the South gets a guarantee that at least part of that territory, plus Missouri, will allow slavery. But let's just note, this is the first of a lot of compromises to follow. This is the first time the United States is going to compromise on this issue of slavery. It's not going to be the last. And what we're going to find is that for the next 30 or so years, the United States is going to be bringing states into the Union in pairs. One free state followed by a slave state, or vice versa, in order to keep that balance of power between slave states and free states intact. In other words, for the next 30 years, by bringing those states in pairs, the United States isn't going to have to make those hard decisions, those hard, that difficult decision about slavery, whether or not it should be abolished or not. They can just keep that balance of power in the states equal, and thus they don't have to deal with slavery at this point in time. Okay, I would urge you to perhaps Google Missouri Compromise or look it up in your online textbook if this isn't making tons of sense. The Missouri Compromise, again, is extremely important. 1, again, Missouri comes into the Union as a slave state. Maine comes into the Union free to keep that balance of power in the Senate, 50-50. And the Louisiana Territory is divided. Again, the dividing line is the southern border of Missouri, to the end of the purchase. Everything north of it except Missouri is free. Everything south of it plus Missouri is slave. Now, another issue that the United States is dealing with after the War of 1812 has to do with foreign affairs. You're always going to have to deal with international issues, with relations with foreign nations, and this period after the war is no exception. What we're going to begin to see around 1819, 1820 or so is that Spain is beginning to lose its colonies in Central and South America. The Spanish colonies, you remember, they had been established back in the 1600s, making Spain one of the most powerful nations on earth at that point in time. But in the 1819s, 18-teens, 1820s, the Spanish Empire was beginning to break up. Spanish colonies, like Mexico, for example, were rebelling from Spain and seeking their independence. Now, in theory, the United States supported those independence movements. I mean, that's exactly what the American colonies had done against Britain. But on the other hand, the American president, James Monroe, and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, son of the second president, John Adams, they're a little bit concerned about this. They were very much afraid that other European nations might take advantage of the rebellions in the Spanish Empire in South America and Central America, and they might decide to try to take over some of those colonies. Other European nations might decide to try and expand their footprint, in a sense, in the Americas, and step in to fill the void, in a sense, as those colonies were attempting to break away from Spain. This was a real concern. So in the light of that development, James Monroe and his Secretary of State began to craft a new foreign policy stance for the United States. They began to put together a policy to, in a sense, try to hinder any attempts of Europe to gain territory in Central or South America. The result of that will be the policy known as the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was stated in 1823 as a message to Congress. It's named for James Monroe, the president, of course, but we should note it was actually written by the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. But if you're the president, you get your name on stuff. So the Monroe Doctrine states the following. 1. The United States will pledge its continued neutrality in foreign affairs. The United States would pledge not to intervene in European affairs. But second, in return, Europe was to consider the Western Hemisphere closed to any further colonization. The United States pledges not to intervene in European affairs. They'll stay neutral. But Europe is to consider the Western Hemisphere, right, all of the Americas now, closed to any further European colonization, the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the United States did threaten, in a sense, the world, Europe, with war if they attempted to violate the Monroe Doctrine, if they did indeed attempt to gain more territory in the Americas. Now, let's think about this. The United States is not even 50 years old at this point in time. The United States does not have much of a military. But here the United States is kind of puffing up their chest and saying, okay, Europe, you stay out of our hemisphere, right? We don't want any more European colonization in all of the Americas, or we're going to fight you. Never mind that they really couldn't have actually successfully gone to war with any European power at this point in time. But I think the Monroe Doctrine in many ways is kind of an assertion of what America wants to be. America, with this doctrine, is kind of setting itself up as the protector of the Western Hemisphere. You know, we will fight any foreign power that's attempting to gain control of any parts of the Americas. That's a pretty gutsy thing for a little baby nation, not even 50 years old, to do. I think it does show us that Americans have an aspiration to be a world power. But making this policy so early in the country's life is a pretty interesting thing that's being done here. Now, let us note the Monroe Doctrine didn't really scare anybody off. No European nation wanted to try to take control of those rebellious Spanish colonies. Why would they try to take over, say, Mexico, when Mexico is already rebelling against Spain? I mean, wouldn't they just rebel against any other nation as well? But again, the Monroe Doctrine, although not of much use back in the 1820s, will come in handy for later presidents in the late 19th and early 20th century, who have used it to assert American dominance over the Western Hemisphere. So that completes part 1 of this lecture, and we will continue on to part 2 in another video. Thanks a lot.